The buzz started before the scream. On my phone screen. The porch looked calm under the late afternoon sun, a cardboard box sitting harmlessly by the mat. Then her shadow slid into frame, the HOA badge catching the light, right before the hornet-trap exploded in color. Subscribe before I explain how karma finally cornered the woman who thought she owned our street. Stay with me until the end. That summer in Willowcrest, our cul-de-sac looked like the kind of place nothing truly bad ever happened. The lawn stayed shaved to the exact length approved by the handbook. The mailboxes all matched in color, and even the trash bins rolled back from the curb in perfect formation. Morning smelled of wet sprinklers and coffee, and the only sounds were birds and the soft groan of garage doors lifting. On paper, it was safe, predictable, controlled. My life followed the same quiet rhythm. I worked from a small desk by the front window, my laptop open to spreadsheets, while I listened to the familiar rumble of delivery trucks. With my job mostly online and my family spread out, packages had become my lifelines: books, equipment, small gifts, a new pair of headphones, even supplements my distant mother relied on. Brown boxes appeared like little promises on the welcome mat, bringing the outside world to my quiet, carefully managed street. The first time a package disappeared, I blamed the shipping company. It had been a small padded envelope. Nothing special. Some cables I needed to fix my aging monitor. The tracking page said delivered, front door, stamped in crisp black letters next to 3:14 p.m. But when I opened the door, warm air pressing against my face, there was only the faint smell of hot concrete and the empty mat. I shrugged it off, thinking of Miss Gann's human error, and requested a replacement. The second time, it wasn't as easy to dismiss. This one mattered. It was a set of specialized supplements my mother's doctor had recommended, delivered straight to me because her building often lost mail. Again, the tracking page insisted it had been left at my door. Again, there was nothing but a faint rectangle of cleaner concrete where a box should have rested, and an uneasy silence where relief should have been. The street looked the same. Kids, bikes, and driveways, wind chimes barely moving, but I felt something invisible shift. Our HOA president, Lana Harlow, stood at the center of all that invisible gravity. She lived at the corner in a house that always looked a little too polished, with flower beds that seemed arranged by algorithm rather than human hands. Her hair never moved, even when the wind pushed leaves into chaotic spirals along the gutter. She moved with the clipped precision of someone who believed every inch of the neighborhood was an extension of her living room. Her clipboard, always in hand, was like a second spine. 2 days after the second package vanished, a letter from the HOA slid under my door with the rest of the mail. The envelope smelled faintly of toner and perfume. Inside, a formal notice informed me that visible deliveries left unattended on the porch violated community standards and invited crime and disorder. The words cut deeper because my porch had been empty when each package had supposedly arrived. It felt like being scolded for a mess someone else had made and quietly hidden. The third missing delivery pushed inconvenience into violation. It was a compact microphone I'd saved for, meant to upgrade my work setup and secure a new side contract. The tracking screen showed a familiar pattern: out for delivery, then delivered, then nothing. No box. Just a slightly darker patch of concrete hinting that something had briefly sat there, then vanished. My chest felt tight as the afternoon heat seeped into the hallway, and the house, usually my sanctuary, felt exposed, like someone had taken a piece of it without asking. That night, I ordered a cheap security camera. The plastic smelled sharp and new as I mounted it above the door, the screws squeaking softly into the wood frame. The lens stared down from the eaves like a silent, unblinking eye. When I tested on my phone, I watched the delayed image of my own hand waving. The familiar porch now a stage under a digital frame. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone on it. At the next HOA meeting in the community room, the air felt colder than the thermostat announced. Folding chairs scraped as neighbors settled in, murmurs rising like a low tide. I listened to Lana talk about maintaining our image and discouraging unsavory elements, all while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. When the topic of safety came up, she spoke about locking cars and reporting strangers, but brushed off my brief mention of missing packages as a shipping issue. Her eyes barely lingered on me before moving on to lawn heights and approved mulch colors. Walking home that evening, the neighborhood felt different. The streetlights cast long, thin shadows over driveways and hedges, and the air held a faint hint of something metallic, like the beginning of a storm. The houses looked the same, but each darkened porch felt like a small, private vulnerability. I glanced at my own door, the small camera status light glowing faintly, and hoped it would show me something I could actually use. Later that night, the only sounds in my living room were the soft ticking of the clock and the occasional distant bark of a dog. I opened the camera app and scrolled back through that day's recordings, the video marked by tiny motion alerts. Mostly, I saw ordinary things: a cat, the mailman, a gust of wind picking up a leaf. Then one clip caught my eye, a shape at the very edge of the frame, moving deliberately toward my porch. I tapped it, and the video filled the screen. The figure was half out of view, body angled so that the brim of a sun hat hid the face. A sleeve crossed into the center of the image, pastel fabric with a tiny floral pattern I had seen at HOA meetings, and a hand reached toward the bottom of the screen, where the package would have been. On the wrist, reflected briefly in the light, was a familiar glint of an HOA badge. My stomach sank, and the quiet room suddenly felt too small for what I'd just seen. The moment froze on my screen, the floral sleeve reaching, fingers curling, badge catching the light. It wasn't proof anyone else would accept yet, but my gut already knew the thief might not have been a stranger at all. Later that week, the air in Willow Crest turned heavier, as if the summer heat pressed down harder on our small routines. Lawns still shimmer with sprinkler mist in the mornings, but every time I opened my door, I felt the weight of more than just humidity. The porch had become a silent question mark in front of my house, and my eyes automatically searched for packages before my mind even registered the daylight. Another letter arrived, its edges sharp enough to feel dangerous. This time, the HOA notice accused me of creating a perception of neglect by supposedly leaving items visible and unsecured on my property. The irony burned as I stood on the exact empty concrete they claimed was cluttered. It was like being censured for footprints in snow that had disappeared, told the evidence of my victimhood was itself an offense against their sense of order. The camera footage looped in my mind even when I wasn't watching it. That floral sleeve, the hard angle of the shoulder, the glint of the badge. I had replayed the clip again and again, pausing, zooming in until the pixels smeared. It wasn't clear enough to march into a meeting with, but it was clear enough to twist my perception of every polite smile I saw on the sidewalk. I started noticing the way Lana's gaze swept porches as she walked, her eyes flicking briefly to welcome mats as if auditing them. Deliveries didn't stop just because my trust did. Work equipment, replacement items, even small things like coffee filters and printer ink still made their way through the network of warehouses and trucks toward my address. The distant rumble of a delivery van no longer brought that tiny thrill of anticipation. Instead, it tightened something in my chest. I found myself listening more carefully for each brake squeal and door slam, the sounds carrying clearly in a narrow street and echoing inside my ribs. I tried to solve it with logistics at first. I added notes to delivery instructions, asking drivers to hide packages, to place them behind the plant stand, to ring the bell twice. Some followed the instructions. Others didn't. On the days when I couldn't pause work to hover by the door, the dread stayed with me. Would I return to find another vanished box, another calm, empty porch under a sun that didn't care what went missing? The camera angle nagged at me. The thief, if it really was who I suspected, had stayed cleverly half off screen. One evening, while the sky turned orange in the front window and the air smelled faintly of cut grass, I hauled out the little stepladder again. The metal creaked under my weight as I adjusted the camera, angling it wider to capture more of the walkway and the street beyond. I added a second camera, tucked discreetly behind the glass of the front window, pointed at a different angle. I wanted converging lines of sight, a crisscross that left no blind side. The emotional pressure seeped into everything. Sleep thinned out into shallow stretches between jolts of wakefulness. I found myself checking the camera feeds late at night, the glow of the screen washing my face in pale light, while the rest of the house stayed dark. This has to stop drifted through my mind more than once, not as a shout, but as a tired whisper pressing against the edges of my patience. On Thursday, a small but deliberate experiment began. I ordered a cheap, replaceable item I didn't really need and scheduled delivery for mid-afternoon, when the street usually lay quiet and empty. When the tracking updated to out for delivery, my pulse picked up. The world outside my window looked ordinary. An old sedan passing, a dog walker tugging at a leash, but I knew I'd just placed bait on a hook. The moment the truck left, I took a deep breath and stepped away from the door, refusing to hover, letting the cameras do the watching for me. Hours later, the light had softened into late-day gold when I finally opened the door. The box was gone. The air smelled faintly of warm cardboard and dust, as if something had just recently sat there. No breeze blew hard enough to move it. No neighbor stood nearby holding it. My stomach dropped in a familiar way. The van had come, the package had appeared, and then the pattern had repeated. Disappearance in the thin, suburban air. Inside, the living room felt too quiet as I opened the app again. The timeline showed a new motion clip flagged around the time the package should have been taken. I tapped it and leaned forward without realizing the fabric of the couch rough under my hands. The video started with the empty street, the box sitting obediently near the mat, the shadows of the eaves slicing diagonally across the concrete like dark blades. Then she walked into frame more fully than before. Lana's posture was unmistakable. The straight spine, the measured steps, the clipboard balanced against her side. She moved as if she belonged to the scene more than the houses did. Her gaze swept the street once, then settled on my door. The floral sleeve fluttered briefly as she reached down, fingers closing around the box with practiced ease. For a moment, the HOA badge on her chest caught the light, a small metallic assertion of authority. I paused the video at that exact frame. The badge, the clipboard, the hand carrying a package that was no longer mine. There was no friendly knock in the next clip, no follow-up image of her returning it. The footage simply cut to an empty porch again, the silence thick as dust. That gap between her hand closing and the blank concrete felt like the true crime, more than the missing object itself. A heavy pulse beat in my ears as I saved the clip and printed a still frame from it. The printer whirring in the dim study. The paper slid out warm, the image slightly grainy but unmistakable. My fingers trembled as I held it, not from fear of her, but from the realization of what this meant. I wasn't dealing with a random stranger, a passing opportunist. I was facing the person who signed the letters, wrote the rules, and decided what order looked like on our street. As the sun set outside, the picture of her, frozen mid-theft with that little emblem of authority pinned to her chest, lay on my table like a quiet accusation I could no longer ignore. 2 days later, the air felt different even before I opened the blinds. A dull weight pressed on the morning, as if the sky itself was reluctant. Sunlight seeped through in thin strips across the floor, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily despite the heaviness in my chest. I stared at the printed frame of Lana on the table, the ink fully dry, and knew impulses alone couldn't guide what came next. I wanted to storm into the next HOA meeting, slam the picture down, and watch her composure crack. The thought flickered like a brief flash of lightning in my mind. But beneath that flash lay a more enduring worry. This had to be more than a moment of satisfaction. It had to be undeniable. If I mishandled it, she could twist the narrative, call it misunderstanding, paint me as unstable. I needed a pattern, not a single storm cloud. So I began tracking everything. I opened a new spreadsheet on my laptop, the cells blank and waiting like unmarked boxes on a porch. Date, time, carrier, contents, tracking number, status, outcome. Each row became a line in an invisible story that had been unfolding without structure. As I filled in the days and deliveries, a grim kind of order emerged. Packages marked delivered that had never made it past my front step, times that aligned suspiciously with certain HOA walk-throughs. Little coincidences that didn't feel like coincidences anymore. I called carriers, my voice steady even though my pulse skipped. Without quoting anyone directly, the conversations left impressions. The drivers knew my house. They insisted they left the packages as instructed. No reports of problems, no notes of packages returned. One even mentioned in passing that someone from the neighborhood association had occasionally approached them about improper drop-offs on certain streets. The words rang in my ears long after call ended, like a faint alarm under ordinary sounds. Discreet questions around the neighborhood filled in the empty spaces. A neighbor a few houses down mentioned losing a small electronics order, chalked up at the time to courier error. Another had a book vanish, a little frustration that had faded into resignation. A kid from across the street, eyes wide as he recalled it to his parents, remembered seeing a lady with a clipboard picking up boxes from doorsteps more than once. I stitched these impressions together mentally, careful not to turn them into a mob, but into context. At night, the house glowed faint blue from the laptop screen as I dug deeper into what people did when their homes were quietly violated. I read about porch pirates and security setups, deterrents and legal options. My fingers hovered over guides explaining how to blast wrongdoers online for public scrutiny, but something in me recoiled. I don't want a spectacle. I want the truth to stand on its own, slip through my mind, anchor me to a quieter form of justice. Somewhere between articles about preventative measures and cautionary tales, an idea formed, not as vengeance, but as exposure. I read about dye packs used in banks, harmless but unmistakable, meant to mark stolen money with vivid color. That image of undeniable, visible guilt clung to my thoughts. I wanted something similar, something that couldn't be explained away as rumor or misinterpretation. Not pain, not injury, just truth that clung where it belonged. A memory surfaced of an old field recorder tucked in a box in my closet, a relic from a college biology course where we collected insect sounds for a project. I dug it out, the plastic casing dusty but intact, and scrolled to the tiny list of save files. There was the furious buzz of hornets, recorded near a nest one hot afternoon years ago, the sound dense and unnerving even now as it crackled softly through the tiny speaker. The idea sharpened. I could build a decoy package, nothing dangerous, just a box with a small, motion-activated speaker hidden inside, loaded with that hornet recording. Alongside it, a dye packet, non-toxic, washable but dramatic, that would burst when handled roughly, marking whoever took it with a color you couldn't ignore. No real stings, no actual insects, just a suggestion of danger and the permanent stain of exposure. The trap would be more psychological than physical, an echo of the fear she'd been creating in our street in a different form. I spent the afternoon assembling it at my kitchen table. The cardboard smelled faintly of glue. I lined the inside, cushioning the small speaker and battery with soft packing material, so the components wouldn't rattle. Nestled alongside it, I taped a thin balloon filled with bright orange washable paint, fortified just enough to burst with movement. The recorder fit snugly, wired to a simple motion sensor I ordered overnight. When I tested it, the box stayed silent until I lifted it. Then the hornet buzz roared to life, thick and startling, vibrating the air in the small room. On the outside, I printed a label using my basic home printer. Property of Willow County Entomology Department, active hornet study sample. Do not tamper. The words added a layer of plausibility and warning that any reasonable person would heed. I added the tracking label from another low-value shipment to make it look convincingly real. No part of this would harm anyone. It would just reveal intent where denials might otherwise flourish. That evening, as the skies shifted from blue to deep violet, I positioned the decoy box on my porch where the cameras could see it from both angles. The concrete held the day's warmth under my feet, radiating faintly upward. I placed a small, inexpensive reel package beside it to complete the illusion of ordinary delivery. The tiny status lights on the cameras glowed softly above me like patient eyes. Inside, the house felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air holds its breath. I checked the app one more time, watching the empty image of my porch with the two boxes sitting quietly, shadows lengthening around them. Let the truth walk to its own trap. Echoed in my mind not as cruelty, but as a quiet acceptance that some choices return to their owner eventually. Then I set my phone down, closed the blinds halfway, and waited for whatever karma would decide to do with the bait I had just laid in the middle of my carefully regulated street. The next afternoon arrived slow and heavy, the heat pressing down, until even the cicadas seemed lazy. Light pooled thickly on the asphalt, creating shimmering waves that made the distant end of the street look like it was melting. Inside my house, the air conditioner hummed in weary cycles, and my focus fractured between work emails and a live view of my porch on my phone, where the decoy box sat quietly in the pale sun. Around midday, the familiar rumble of a delivery truck rolled up the street, the sound swelling, then fading as it stopped in front of my house. On the screen, I watched the delivery driver step into view, his movements efficient and practiced. He placed another small box beside the two already there, scanned it, and left without lingering. The doorbell never rang, but my heartbeat did, steady and loud in my ears. My porch now displayed a small constellation of cardboard, each box casting a neat rectangular shadow. For a while, nothing happened. The live feed showed only the slow movement of light across the concrete, the shifting pattern of shadows as the sun arced overhead. A stray leaf skittered by on a faint breeze. A jogger passed in the distance, headphones on, oblivious to the small stage of traps and ordinary deliveries at the center of my frame. Time stretched thin, each minute dragging across my nerves as I pretended to concentrate on work. When motion finally flickered on the screen, it was subtle at first, a lengthened shadow at the edge, a brief blur of movement near the hedges. Then Lana stepped fully into view, the scene snapping into sharp focus. She wore her usual crisp cardigan, clipboard tucked under one arm, the HOA badge gleaming on her chest. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if she was simply doing her usual patrol. To anyone else, it might have looked like a routine walk. To me, it was a telltale orbit closing in. She paused near my walkway, gaze sweeping up and down the street. The neighborhood around her lay quiet and sun-drenched, blinds half-drawn, cars parked neatly. No one visible, only the cameras watching. Her eyes shifted to my porch. The boxes sat there, innocently stacked, the warning label on the decoy catching the light. The words "Active Hornet Study" stared back at her from the cardboard, a clearly printed barrier between cautious observers and reckless hands. If the warning slowed her, it didn't show on the screen. My phone captured the slight lift of her chin, the subtle narrowing of her eyes. She moved past the sign, stepping onto the path with the practiced entitlement of someone who believed she had authority over every surface her shoes touched. Her hand extended, fingers reaching for the decoy box first, the one with conspicuous label, as if drawn more strongly to the thing that tried to tell her no. The motion sensor woke faster than my breath could fully catch. As soon as her hand lifted the box, the Hornet recording erupted inside, a dense, furious buzz that spilled through her fingers into the open air, even to the phone's tiny speakers. The sound crawled under the skin, vibration and panic compressed into noise. On screen, Lana flinched violently, shoulders jerking, eyes widening. Her clipboard slipped, papers bowing outward like startled birds. Panic snapped her movements into chaos. Instead of dropping the box, she clutched it, closer, as if to subdue it. The pressure against the thin balloon inside crossed the threshold I had designed. The dye pack burst with a muffled pop, sending a spray of bright orange paint exploding across her cardigan, chest, and hands. The color spread fast, seeping into fabric, dripping down her fingers, splattering the walkway with vivid spots that looked impossible to ignore. Fear painted her expression even more starkly than the dye. She twisted away, eyes darting as if invisible insects swarmed around her. There were no real hornets in that moment, only the sound and her own imagination. But the trap worked exactly as intended. The buzzing continued, relentless, echoing between the houses like a swarm that had been waiting patiently in silence. Her footsteps became frantic scuffs on the concrete as she staggered back, streaks of orange marking each frantic movement. From behind curtains and half-open blinds, the neighborhood began to stir. A door opened down the street as someone stepped out, drawn by the commotion. Another neighbor paused on their driveway, staring, keys in hand. The camera view widened in my mind as I imagined the scene beyond its frame. The polished president of our HOA, suddenly messy and marked, flailing on a porch she had treated as her domain, wrapped in the soundtrack of panic she once sewed more quietly. On the feed, a car slowed. One of the other board members, recognizable by his usual commute time, leaned forward over the steering wheel, studying the scene through his windshield. I watched his car idle there for a moment, the Hornet was spilling even faintly into his closed vehicle. His expression shifted from confusion to realization as he caught sight of the badge on her chest, now half obscured by orange. Lana finally dropped the box, letting it tumble onto the mat with the buzzing still roaring from within. The dye streaked down her skirt, staining the once neat lines of her outfit with chaotic strokes. She turned on her heel and fled down the path, leaving orange footprints across the gray concrete, each one a small piece of evidence drying in the hot sun. My cameras recorded every step, each flung drop of paint, every twitch of fear that crossed her face. The buzzing eventually looped and faded as the battery timed out, leaving the porch in silence again. But the scene it left behind couldn't be erased so easily. The decoy box sat open, its innards exposed, the label clearly visible in the frame. The paint splatters formed a trail, leading down the walkway and across the sidewalk in the direction of Lana's house. The neat, controlled landscape of Willow Crest suddenly looked interrupted, marked by color and movement that hadn't been approved in any handbook. About an hour later, as I sat in the dim coolness of my living room, my phone chimed with a new email from the HOA mailing list. The subject line read, "Emergency board meeting tonight. Attendance strongly encouraged." The body mentioned recent security concerns and an incident involving porch safety. My fingers lingered over the screen as a slow, calm certainty settled in my chest. For the first time since my packages had started disappearing, I felt the balance of power tilt. Not because I had shouted or threatened, but because the truth had painted itself in a color too bright to ignore. That evening, the community center felt less like a meeting space and more like a courtroom without a judge. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making everything look a little harsher. Faces more tired, papers paler, the scuff marks on the tile floor more noticeable. Folding chairs lined up in uneven rows, filled slowly by neighbors who usually avoided these gatherings. A murmur of low voices drifted through the room, flavored with curiosity and something that sounded a lot like quiet anger. I sat near the middle, a folder on my lap that felt heavier than its actual weight. Inside lay printed screenshots, my spreadsheet of deliveries, and a small USB drive with the video files saved in chronological order. My hands rested on the folder, palms slightly damp, as I watched Lana take a seat near the front. Her cardigan was a different color now, but faint traces of orange clung stubbornly at the edges of her cuffs, like the last echoes of confession that couldn't be fully scrubbed away. The board called the meeting to order with the usual formalities, but the energy in the room was different. People leaned forward instead of slouching back. Eyes stayed fixed on the table, instead of wandering to the exits. When the agenda reached neighborhood safety concerns, the air seemed to thicken, as if everyone inhaled and then forgot to exhale. A faint smell of anxiety, sweat paper, coffee, hung underneath the harsh chemical cleaning scent. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, the legs of my chair scraping softly against the floor. I didn't raise my voice. I laid out the facts, one by one, in the same careful order I'd built in my spreadsheet. Date, time, item, tracking status, outcome. The pattern emerged not as an accusation, but as a shape no one could deny. Then I mentioned the cameras. The room, already quiet, seemed to lean toward the front. They dimmed the lights and turned on the small projector, its fan whirring loudly in the sudden relative darkness. On the wall, my porch appeared, recognizable to everyone in the room, just another empty doorstep among many on our street. I played the first clip, packages appearing, then vanishing. Then the second, where Lana's arm and badge came into view. Murmurs rippled softly, then still when she appeared in the next video fully, framed in the center as she lifted the decoy box. The Hornet buzz filled the speakers, louder in the enclosed room than it had been through my phone. People flinched instinctively, some shifting in their chairs, others pressing their lips together in thin lines. On the wall, they watched their president panic, stumble, and be marked in brilliant orange. The color glowed under the camera's neutral eye, impossible to mistake. The sound cut off abruptly when the clip ended, leaving a silence heavier than any buzzing. I didn't look at Lana while the videos played. Instead, I watched the faces in the room, Eyebrows raised, mouth tightening, some eyes narrowing as years of small grievances and quiet obedience ran through their minds. The evidence didn't shout. It simply existed, looping her choices back to her in front of everyone she had once controlled through letters and rules and perfected disapproval. When the projector shut off, the overhead lights flickered back to full brightness. Lana sat rigidly in her chair, hands clasped tightly on her lap. Her jaw was set, eyes slightly glossy but defiant. She spoke when prompted, presenting a carefully constructed explanation about temporarily securing packages, preventing clutter, and holding items to address violations that simply didn't align with the timelines, the footage, or the boxes that had never been returned. Each excuse sounded thinner than the previous one, when held against the bright stain on the video and the quiet tally in my spreadsheet. Other voices joined in, not shouting, but adding their own missing packages, their own suspicions they'd swallowed. A board member admitted losing an order months back and feeling powerless to challenge the leader they had trusted. Another neighbor described spotting her near their steps one afternoon with no clear reason to be there. The image of her in orange had unlocked something in the room. Permission to say out loud what had once been only uneasy thoughts behind closed curtains. The board deliberated in low tones at the front, their heads bent together. The rest of us waited, the room thick with the weight of what everyone had just seen. My heart pounded, not with vindictiveness, but with the raw vulnerability of someone handing over their story to a group and hoping it wouldn't be twisted again. Let them choose truth over comfort slipped quietly through my mind, like a small, steady prayer detached from any ritual, rooted only in the need for justice. When the decision came, it landed with the softness of inevitability, rather than the shock of surprise. The board removed Lana from her position as HOA president, citing misuse of authority, violation of property, and erosion of trust. Her access to association funds and storage areas was revoked. An audit of items held under her control would be conducted. Restitution would be arranged for missing deliveries where possible. Additionally, they announced plans to install secure parcel lockers near the community center, funded by the HOA, so no one's items would sit vulnerable on exposed porches again. Lana received a decision with a brittle stillness. She didn't lash out or cause a scene. That, perhaps, would have given her back some sense of control. Instead, she sat there, briefly stripped of the invisible armor that had wrapped her for years. Her eyes stayed fixed on the table in front of her, avoiding the faces around her that now knew something about her she hadn't intended to reveal. The orange stain on her cuffs remained like a quiet echo of the footage we'd all just watched. As the meeting adjourned, chairs squeaked and people rose in small clusters, speaking softly. Some thanked me as they passed, their words simple, their hands briefly resting on my shoulder or forearm. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, as if the whole process had been a long exhale I'd held for months. The night air outside felt cooler than it had in days. Crickets chirped in the bushes, and the sky above the street glowed faintly, washed by distant city lights. Walking home under that sky, I passed Lana's house. The curtains were drawn tight, no warm light spilling out. For the first time, it looked small, not because it physically changed, but because the fear projected had been punctured. I realized then that the real trap she couldn't escape hadn't been my buzzing decoy box. It had been the cage of her own need to control, to claim ownership over things that were never hers in the first place. The next morning, a temporary sign appeared on the community notice board, announcing the upcoming installation of parcel lockers and new guidelines for secure deliveries. The paper fluttered slightly in a softer breeze, the pushpins holding it steady. Later that week, a delivery driver placed a package inside the first locker installed, swiped it closed, and glanced up at me with a small nod as I retrieved it. The metal door felt cool under my hand, solid and trustworthy. Karma, I realized, hadn't come in the form of loud confrontations or dramatic showdowns. It had arrived as a swarm of buzzing speakers, a splash of vivid paint, and a quiet room forced to watch itself in a mirror. It had turned the same tools of surveillance and order that once oppressed us into instruments of truth. In the end, the street didn't just get justice for stolen packages. It got something deeper. The reminder that no matter how many rules someone writes, the truth has its own way of finding the people who try to hide it. And sometimes It does that with a sound you can't ignore and a color that refuses to wash off as quickly as guilt would like.